Picture the Sahara Desert, not the edges of it, where a few hardy shrubs cling to life. The deep Sahara, southern Libya, a place so dry that some weather stations here have gone entire years without recording a single drop of rain. Sand stretches to every horizon. Daytime temperatures regularly cross 45 degrees Celsius. At night, the same ground that scorched your feet hours earlier can drop close to freezing. There is no river, there is no lake. By every rule we normally use to define where a civilization can exist, this land should be empty. And yet, if you fly a drone over a stretch of this desert today, you'll see something that looks almost unnatural. Rows of dark circular depressions, spaced with eerie regularity, marching in perfectly straight lines across the dunes for kilometers. From above, they look like a chain of craters, like something out of an alien landscape. For decades, some researchers who first spotted them in aerial photographs genuinely weren't sure what they were looking at. They are not craters. They are the fingerprints of one of the most audacious engineering projects in the ancient world, a hidden network of tunnels, shafts and channels that once moved water for hundreds of kilometers underground, entirely by gravity, without a single pump, without a single drop of fuel, without any technology we would recognize as modern. This system quietly irrigated fields, filled cisterns, and sustained cities in a place the Romans themselves described as uninhabitable. The people who built it have almost vanished from popular memory. You won't find them in most world history textbooks. Ancient Greek and Roman writers dismissed them as savage raiders, chariot-riding desert nomads who existed only to be feared or conquered. For centuries, that's the only version of the story that survived, because for centuries, it was the only version anyone bothered to write down. But the archaeology tells a completely different story. It tells us of walled cities with populations in the tens of thousands, of a literate, cosmopolitan trading power that dealt in gold, salt, ivory, and slaves across a trade network stretching from the Mediterranean coast to deep sub-Saharan Africa, of a civilization sophisticated enough to build monumental tombs, import Roman glassware and wine by the shipload, and engineer one of the most advanced water management systems anywhere in the pre-industrial world, centuries before Rome perfected its own aqueducts. They were called the Garamantes, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how they pulled off something that, on paper, should have been impossible, and more importantly, why the very ingenuity that built their empire is also the reason it eventually collapsed. Because there's a twist buried in this story, one hiding in the geology beneath the Sahara itself, and I promise you, it's going to change the way you think about sustainable civilizations. Stick around, because later in this video, we're going to walk through exactly what happened underground, foot by foot, and why modern hydrologists studying this site describe what the Garamantes did as equal parts genius and a slow-motion trap they never saw coming. Let's start at the beginning. To understand the Garamantes, you first need to understand where they lived, because the location is really the whole story. Their homeland was a region called the Fezzan, today part of southwestern Libya. If you look at a map of the Sahara, the Fezzan sits almost dead center of the desert's northern half, about 600 to 800 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast, in every direction that matters. To the north lies the Hamada al-Hamra, a brutal stone plateau. To the south and west, the vast dune seas of the Sahara proper, including the towering sand mountains of the Idehan Ubari and Idehan Murzuk. This is not an oasis on the fringe of the desert. This is the middle of it. Modern satellite data and climate reconstructions tell us that the Sahara wasn't always this hostile. Around 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, during what climatologists call the African humid period, the region we now call the Fezzan was green. There were lakes, rivers, savanna grasslands, and the rock art left behind by the hunter-herder peoples of that era, vivid paintings and carvings of giraffes, elephants, hippos, and cattle, still survives on the walls of caves and rock shelters scattered across the desert today. This is one of the curiosities we'll come back to later in the video, because it turns out that Green Sahara didn't just disappear, it left something behind, buried deep underground, that the Garamantes would later discover almost by accident, and that discovery is arguably the real starting point of their entire civilization. By roughly 3000 BCE, the climate had shifted dramatically. The rains retreated south, the lakes dried up, and the region became the desert we recognize today. Most of the population that had lived there during the humid period either migrated out or adapted. And it's out of that adaptation, over the following 2 millennia, that a distinct culture began to emerge in the Fezzan, one that archaeologists now identify as the ancestors of the Garamantes. The first written mentions of the Garamantes come to us not from the Garamantes themselves, but from outsiders. And this matters, because it shapes almost everything that was believed about them for the next 2,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a people called the Garamantes, living deep in Libya, whom he portrayed as a very great nation, who covered the earth with soil over the salt, and then farmed it, and who hunted cave-dwelling Ethiopians, likely a reference to other Saharan peoples, using 4-horse chariots. That last detail is important, and it's actually backed up by the archaeological record. Rock art across the Fezzan shows Garamantian-style chariots in astonishing detail, and this evidence has fueled one of the more debated theories in Saharan archaeology, that the Garamantes maintained a network of chariot routes across the desert for trade and communication, centuries before camels became the dominant Saharan transport animal. We'll dig into exactly how this trade network functioned a little later, because it connects directly to how the Garamantes financed the incredible engineering project that made their whole civilization possible. Later Roman writers picked up where Herodotus left off, but their tone shifted from curious to hostile. Rome and the Garamantes had a long, complicated relationship, sometimes trading partners, sometimes military adversaries, and Roman writers like Tacitus and Pliny the Elder tended to describe the Garamantes as a nuisance at best and a barbarian menace at worst. Roman general Cornelius Balbus led a military campaign against them in 19 BCE, and Roman accounts triumphantly listed the Garamantian towns his forces captured, including their capital. For nearly 2,000 years, this was essentially all anyone knew about the Garamantes, a handful of second-hand, often unflattering, accounts written by their neighbors and occasional enemies. No Garamantian literature survived. If they had a fully developed writing system, and there's growing evidence they used a script related to ancient Libyco-Berber inscriptions, we haven't been able to fully translate their own historical records. For most of modern history, this civilization was a footnote, a strange desert people mentioned in passing by classical authors, assumed by many 20th century historians to have been a minor, unsophisticated tribal confederation. Then, starting in the mid-20th century and accelerating dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s with the help of satellite imagery and systematic archaeological survey, everything we thought we knew about the Garamantes was blown apart. And what researchers found didn't just add detail to the old story, it completely rewrote it, because it turns out the Garamantes weren't a minor desert tribe at all. They were the center of a sophisticated state, with a capital city of tens of thousands of people, monumental architecture, a defined social hierarchy, international trade relationships stretching from Rome to the edge of sub-Saharan Africa, and underneath all of it, an engineering system so advanced that some archaeologists have called it one of the great hidden achievements of the ancient world. But before we get to the water, and trust me, the water is where this story gets genuinely astonishing, we need to talk about why water was such a desperate, civilization-defining problem in the first place. Because to appreciate what the Garamantes accomplished, you have to first appreciate just how impossible their environment was working against them. Let's talk numbers for a second, because they matter here. The Fezzan region today receives, on average, less than 10 millimeters of rainfall per year. In some areas, in some years, that number is effectively zero. For comparison, most of what we'd call a temperate desert climate, think Phoenix, Arizona, gets somewhere around 200 millimeters a year. The Fezzan isn't just dry, it's among the driest inhabited regions on the entire planet. There are no permanent rivers anywhere in the region. There are no natural lakes of any significant size. The nearest reliable surface water, the Nile, is roughly 1,500 kilometers away. If you tried to survive here, relying purely on rainfall and surface water the way most ancient civilizations did, the way the Egyptians relied on the Nile, the Mesopotamians relied on the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus Valley relied on the Indus, you would fail within days. This is, on paper, one of the least hospitable places on Earth for large-scale human settlement, let alone a thriving urban civilization with agriculture, industry, and international trade. So here's the question that should be nagging at you right now. If there's no river, no lake, and almost no rain, where on earth did the Garamantes get enough water to build cities, grow crops, and support a population that at its peak may have reached 100,000 people or more across the Fezzan? The answer lies beneath their feet, and it's a discovery that, when hydrologists and archaeologists finally pieced it together in the late 20th century, completely rewrote what we thought was possible in a hyper-arid environment. Because the Garamantes weren't just surviving on scarce surface water, they had found something else entirely, an invisible resource locked away underground, and they built an entire engineering system specifically designed to extract it, drop by drop, across hundreds of square kilometers of desert. This is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. So let's go underground. Here's the piece of the puzzle that made everything else possible, and it starts with that green Sahara we mentioned earlier. Remember those lakes and rivers that existed thousands of years before the Garamantes ever built a single city? When that humid period ended and the surface water dried up, not all of that water actually disappeared. A huge amount of it sank downward, seeping through sand and rock, until it settled into vast underground reservoirs known as aquifers. Beneath the Fezzan and much of the surrounding Sahara sits one of the largest fossil water reserves on the planet, part of a system geologists now call the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, which stretches beneath Libya, Egypt, Sudan, and Chad. We call this water fossil water because it isn't being actively replenished, or is being replenished only at an extraordinarily slow rate. This water fell as rain thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of years ago. It has been sitting underground, largely undisturbed, ever since, a kind of buried inheritance from a completely different climate era. The Garamantes discovered this water. We don't know exactly how, whether through natural springs that gave early hints of what lay beneath, through observation of vegetation patterns, or through deliberate exploratory digging, but by sometime around the 4th or 5th century BCE, they had figured out that if you dug down far enough in certain locations, you would hit water, not rainfall. Not a river, ancient water, trapped in sandstone layers, sometimes tens of meters below the surface. And this is where the true genius of the Garamantes kicks in, because knowing water exists underground and actually getting that water to your fields and your city, across a landscape shaped by shifting dunes and blistering heat, are two very different problems. Simply digging a well gets you water at a single point. It doesn't get you water flowing across kilometers of farmland. For that, you need something far more ambitious. You need a fogara. Stick with me here, because what I'm about to describe is, frankly, one of the most underrated feats of ancient engineering anywhere in the world. And there's a specific design detail coming up that even trained engineers find genuinely hard to believe was achieved without modern surveying tools. A foggara, sometimes called a qanat in the Persian tradition, where a similar technology likely originated, or a khettara in parts of Morocco, is, in its simplest description, a gently sloping underground tunnel that carries water from an underground source to the surface using nothing but gravity. No pumps, no machinery, no external energy input of any kind beyond the muscle of the people who dug it. Here's how it worked in the Fezzan specifically. Garamantean engineers would identify a point in the desert, often near the base of an escarpment or dune ridge, where the water table sat relatively close to the surface. They would dig a vertical shaft down to that water-bearing layer. Then, and this is the genius part, they would begin digging a horizontal tunnel from the base of that shaft, sloping very gradually downhill toward the location where the water was actually needed. A village, a set of fields, a city. The slope had to be extraordinarily precise. Too steep, and the water would rush through too quickly, eroding the tunnel and causing collapses. Too shallow, and the water wouldn't flow at all, or would flow so slowly it would evaporate or seep away before reaching its destination. Modern surveys of foggara systems in the Sahara have found gradients as gentle as a few centimeters of drop per 100 meters of tunnel length, a level of precision that's genuinely difficult to achieve even with modern laser levels, let alone with whatever rudimentary sighting tools the Garamantes had access to over 2,000 years ago. To dig and maintain a tunnel like this, workers couldn't just dig blind underground for kilometers. So along the length of each foggara, engineers sank a series of vertical access shafts at regular intervals, sometimes every 10 to 20 meters. These shafts served several purposes at once. They let workers haul excavated sand and debris up to the surface as they dug. They provided ventilation so diggers wouldn't suffocate in the tunnel below. They allowed for ongoing maintenance, since tunnels would periodically need to be cleared of collapsed sand or sediment buildup. And critically, they let surveyors check and correct the tunnel's slope as digging progressed, sighting down the line of shafts to make sure the gradient stayed consistent over enormous distances. This is exactly what you're seeing when you look at those strange, crater-like formations from aerial photographs, the ones we described at the very start of this video. Each crater is actually the mounded ring of excavated sand around a vertical shaft, and the perfectly straight lines of dozens or even hundreds of these shaft mounds marching across the desert are the fingerprint of a foggara tunnel running beneath them, sometimes for many kilometers. And the scale of this system, once archaeologists began properly surveying it in the late 20th century, turned out to be almost unbelievable. Researchers have identified literally hundreds of separate foggara systems across the Fezzan, with a combined tunnel length estimated at several hundred kilometers. Some estimates run as high as 750 or more kilometers of underground channels dug entirely by hand through sandstone and sand without any machinery. Some individual foggaras stretched for 4 or 5 kilometers underground on their own. This wasn't a scattering of local wells. This was an integrated regional infrastructure network, built and maintained over centuries, forming the literal circulatory system of an entire civilization. Think about what that actually required. Someone had to survey the underground water table across a region the size of a small country, with no modern instruments. Someone had to organize, feed, and coordinate the labor force needed to dig and maintain hundreds of kilometers of tunnel, labor that, based on archaeological and later historical evidence from similar systems, likely included a significant enslaved workforce, a detail we'll return to when we talk about Garamantean trade and society. Someone had to train generations of specialist diggers and surveyors, because a foggara wasn't a one-time project. It required constant upkeep, tunnel by tunnel, shaft by shaft, indefinitely, for the water to keep flowing. and it worked. For centuries, the water that emerged from the Foggara outlets fed irrigation channels that watered date palm groves, wheat and barley fields, vineyards, and vegetable gardens across the Fezzan. It filled the cisterns of Garamantean towns. It transformed patches of open desert into an interconnected network of farming oases, artificially green pockets sustained entirely by ancient rainwater, sunk deep in sandstone, being slowly and deliberately drawn back up to the surface after thousands of years underground. Now here's a detail that tends to surprise people, and it's worth sitting with for a second. This system predates, or at minimum runs roughly parallel to, some of Rome's most celebrated aqueduct engineering, and it was being carried out by a civilization the Romans themselves publicly dismissed as unsophisticated desert raiders. The people the Roman historians wrote off as barbarians were, underground, quietly running a water engineering operation impressive enough that when 20th century hydrologists finally mapped it properly, several of them described it as one of the most remarkable irrigation achievements of the pre-industrial world. We're going to come back to that irony later, because it plays directly into how the Garamantes actually dealt with Rome, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as battlefield enemies. But first, I want to show you what all of this engineering actually made possible on the surface, because the Foggaras weren't the end goal. They were the foundation for something much bigger, an entire desert civilization, complete with a capital city that, when archaeologists finally began excavating it seriously, turned out to be far larger and far more sophisticated than almost anyone expected. The heart of the Garamantean world was a city called Garama, located near the modern Libyan town of Jarma, or Germa, in the Wadi al-Hayat, a long fertile depression running through the Fezzan that was, quite literally, the breadbasket the Foggara system made possible. For most of the 20th century, Garama was assumed to be a modest settlement. A large village, maybe, but not a true city. That assumption started to collapse once archaeologists, particularly through major surveys and excavations from the 1960s onward and intensified in the 1990s and 2000s, actually got a proper look at what was underneath the sand. What they found was a walled city covering a substantial area, with mud brick architecture, monumental stone tombs on its outskirts, evidence of multi-story buildings, and, crucially, clear signs of central planning and long-term occupation stretching back centuries. Population estimates for Garama, at its peak, generally placed sometime in the first few centuries CE, range from around 4,000 up to as many as 10,000 people within the city itself, with the broader Garamantean territory across the Fezzan potentially supporting a population in the tens of thousands, spread across dozens of smaller fortified towns and villages, all linked by the same Foggara irrigation network that fed the capital. That might not sound enormous by the standards of Rome or Alexandria, but you have to measure it against the environment. This was a genuine urban center, sustained entirely by artificial irrigation, sitting in one of the most extreme deserts on Earth, centuries before anyone would attempt anything comparable in this specific region again. And it wasn't an isolated bubble. It was clearly the political, religious, and economic capital of a much larger, integrated state. The archaeological evidence around Garama paints a picture of real social stratification. Excavated cemeteries show clear differences in burial wealth. Some graves contain little more than the body itself, while others are furnished with imported Roman glassware, fine pottery, jewelry, and other luxury goods, laid out in substantial stone-built tomb structures. Some of the largest Garamantean tombs are genuinely monumental, stepped, pyramid-like structures that some archaeologists have compared, in spirit, if not in scale, to the mortuary architecture of Egypt, suggesting a ruling elite with both the resources and the cultural motivation to visibly mark their status even in death. This wasn't a flat, egalitarian tribal society. In other words, it was a stratified state with kings. Roman sources actually name specific Garamantean rulers, including a king who negotiated directly with Rome, along with an aristocracy, a merchant class, skilled artisans and engineers, farmers working the irrigated fields, and, as we'll get into shortly, an enslaved population whose labor appears to have been central to both the agricultural economy and, quite possibly, the grueling work of digging and maintaining the Sahara tunnels themselves. Now, here's a curiosity worth flagging before we move forward, because it's going to matter a lot when we talk about the Garamantes' eventual decline. None of this, the city, the tombs, the population, the trade wealth, was possible without the water system running continuously and expanding over time. Garama wasn't built once and left alone. The Sahara network had to keep growing, tunnel by tunnel, generation after generation, just to keep pace with a growing population and an increasingly ambitious, increasingly wealthy state. And that continuous expansion, it turns out, is going to be the exact thing that eventually turns this incredible success story into a slow-motion crisis. We'll get there, but first, let's talk about how the Garamantes actually turned this desert oasis empire into serious wealth, because water alone doesn't explain the imported Roman glass, the fine textiles, or the gold. For that, we need to talk about trade. If the Sahara were the circulatory system of the Garamantean world, trade was its lifeblood, and this is where those four-horse chariots Herodotus described actually start to make a lot more sense. The Fezzan sits in a genuinely strategic position, not on the coast, not deep in sub-Saharan Africa, but almost exactly in between. That middle position, which looks like a curse when you're only thinking about rainfall, turns out to be a huge advantage when you're thinking about trade routes. The Garamantes essentially controlled, or at minimum, heavily influenced, some of the key crossing points of what would later be called the trans-Saharan trade network, centuries before the more famous medieval trans-Saharan gold and salt routes that connected Mali and Songhai to North Africa. What moved along these routes? Archaeological evidence and classical sources together sketch out a fairly rich picture. Gold, very likely sourced from areas further south, moved north toward the Mediterranean. Ivory did too. So did wild animals. Rome had an enormous appetite for exotic African animals for its arenas, and the Garamantes appear to have been key middlemen in supplying them. There's also strong evidence, both archaeological and textual, that the Garamantes were heavily involved in the slave trade, capturing or acquiring people from populations further south and moving them north, where they were sold into the Roman world, and quite plausibly also put to work locally, digging the very tunnels that irrigated Garamantean fields. Salt, harvested from desert salt pans, moved in multiple directions, since salt was a genuinely precious commodity for preserving food in the ancient world. And in return, moving south and into the Fezzan itself, came Roman wine, olive oil, fine glassware, ceramics, and processed goods, the same imported Roman luxury items archaeologists keep finding in Garamantean tombs. Excavations at Garama and other Garamantean sites have turned up thousands of fragments of imported Roman amphorae and glass vessels, a direct physical record of just how deeply integrated the Garamantes were into Mediterranean trade networks, despite sitting hundreds of kilometers of hostile desert away from the nearest Roman city. This is also where those chariots come back into the story. The rock art of the Fezzan region includes numerous depictions of light, fast, horse-drawn chariots. And while there's genuine scholarly debate about whether the Garamantes actually used chariots for long-distance desert trade caravans, given how physically demanding that would be for horses in extreme heat with limited water, Most researchers now think chariots were primarily used for warfare, hunting, elite transport, and shorter regional journeys, while the actual heavy lifting of long-distance trans-Saharan trade increasingly relied on a very different animal that starts appearing in the Fezzan archaeological record from around the 1st centuries BCE and CE onward: the camel. The introduction of the camel into Saharan trade was genuinely transformative, and the Garamantes appear to have been among the first Saharan peoples to adopt it at scale. Camels can travel for extended periods with minimal water, carry heavy loads, and tolerate extreme desert heat far better than horses or donkeys. Camel bones and iconography start showing up more prominently in Garamantean archaeological contexts in the centuries around the turn of the millennium, right alongside the peak of Garamantean urban expansion. And that's not a coincidence. Better transport technology, plus a reliable water and food-producing homeland to operate from, meant the Garamantes could project trade influence and sometimes military influence across a genuinely enormous stretch of the Central Sahara. This trade wealth is, in a very real sense, what paid for everything else: the monumental tombs, the imported luxury goods, quite possibly even some of the labor and organizational capacity needed to keep expanding the Fogara network. But wealth and strategic position also drew attention. And just north of the Fezzan sat the single most powerful state in the ancient Mediterranean world, one that was, at various points, extremely interested in what the Garamantes had and extremely unhappy about Garamantean raids on Roman territory. So let's talk about Rome. One more thing worth flagging before we move on, because it's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people. The sheer distance involved in all of this trade puts the Garamantes in a completely different category than most people assume when they picture desert tribes. We're not talking about local barter between neighboring oases. We're talking about goods, and evidently people, moving across a trade network that, at its furthest extent, may have reached deep into the Western and Central Sahara, connecting the Garamantes indirectly to sub-Saharan trading partners hundreds of kilometers to the south, while simultaneously maintaining active commercial relationships with a Mediterranean superpower hundreds of kilometers to the north. Very few societies anywhere in the ancient world, in any environment, managed to sit at the crossroads of two such radically different worlds, sub-Saharan Africa and Mediterranean Europe, and profit from both simultaneously. The Garamantes did it from the middle of a desert that most of their contemporaries assumed was empty. The relationship between the Garamantes and Rome was long, complicated, and swung repeatedly between commerce and conflict, which is exactly what you'd expect from two powers that needed each other economically but had genuinely competing interests along their shared frontier. The first major flashpoint came in 19 BCE, when the Roman proconsul Lucius Cornelius Balbus led a military campaign deep into Garamantean territory, reportedly capturing a string of Garamantean towns, including Garama itself. Roman sources present this as a triumphant conquest, and Balbus was honored with a triumph in Rome for it, a significant honor since he was the last person outside the imperial family to receive one. But here's the thing worth noting. Despite this supposed conquest, the Garamantes were not actually absorbed into the Roman Empire. They continued to exist as an independent, functioning state for centuries afterward, continued expanding their Fogara network, continued their own trade relationships, and continued periodically clashing with Rome. Whatever happened in 19 BCE, it clearly wasn't a knockout blow, more likely a punitive raid intended to punish the Garamantes for supporting a rebellion by another North African group against Rome, and to remind them who held the coastline. Over the following decades and centuries, the relationship seesawed. There's evidence of formal diplomatic contact. A Garamantean king is recorded negotiating directly with Rome. There's substantial evidence of ongoing trade, visible in all that imported Roman material found in Garamantean tombs and settlements. But there's also evidence of continued friction, including further Roman military expeditions into Garamantean territory in the decades that followed, and Roman writers frequently characterized the Garamantes as a persistent source of raiding and instability along Rome's southern frontier in the province of Africa. What's notable, looking at this relationship with the benefit of modern archaeology, is how one-sided the ancient written record actually is. We only really have Rome's side of this story in text form. Rome, as the civilized power, occasionally forced to discipline unruly desert raiders. But the archaeology tells a very different story about who actually had leverage in this relationship. The Garamantes weren't desperate for Roman goods out of backwardness. They were a sophisticated trading state, actively choosing to import specific luxury items that reinforced elite status back home, while exporting commodities, including human beings, that Rome badly wanted. This wasn't a relationship between a civilized empire and desperate barbarians. It was closer to a relationship between two functioning states with overlapping economic interests and a recurring border dispute. It's just that only one of them left behind a large body of surviving literature to tell its version of events. By the later Roman period, into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, direct references to the Garamantes in Roman sources become sparser, and this actually lines up with broader shifts happening in the Fezzan itself. Shifts that, as we're about to get into, had far less to do with Rome and far more to do with something happening deep underground, in the very water system that had built the Garamantean world in the first place. But before we get to the decline, and I promise, we're getting there, let's take a moment to round out the picture of daily life in the Garamantean world, because there's more to this civilization than tombs and trade routes. Beyond the walls of Garama, the Garamantean state was really a network of fortified villages and smaller towns scattered along the Wadi al-Hayat and other watered valleys of the Fezzan, each one sustained by its own local fogara or cluster of fogaras. Archaeological surveys have identified well over 100 such settlement sites across the region, ranging from small fortified farmsteads to substantial walled towns with their own cemeteries and public structures. Agriculture in these irrigated pockets was surprisingly diverse for a desert environment. Excavated plant remains show the Garamantes grew wheat and barley as staple grains, alongside date palms, which were both a food source and practically a critical windbreak and shade crop that helped protect other plants from the brutal desert sun. There's evidence of grapes, suggesting local wine production, alongside the imported Roman variety, and evidence of other fruits and vegetables, sustained entirely by that gravity-fed fogara water. Livestock included cattle, sheep, and goats, along with horses, and, increasingly over time, camels. Garamantean material culture also reflects a genuinely interconnected society, not an isolated one. Alongside imported Roman goods, archaeologists have found locally produced pottery with distinct Garamantean styles, evidence of textile production, metalworking including ironworking, and jewelry combining local materials with imported elements like Mediterranean glass beads. Inscriptions in a script related to ancient Libyco-Berber writing systems, the same broad family that eventually gives rise to the Tifinagh script still used by Tuareg communities today, have been found at Garamantean sites, hinting at a literate, or at least semi-literate elite, though our ability to fully read and interpret these inscriptions remains limited. There's also a compelling genetic and cultural through line worth mentioning here, because it connects the ancient Garamantes directly to people living in the Sahara today. Modern genetic and linguistic research increasingly points to real continuity between the ancient Garamantes and the Berber-speaking populations of the Sahara and North Africa, including groups like the Tuareg, who to this day maintain nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyles across parts of the same desert the Garamantes once irrigated. The Garamantes didn't vanish into nothing. Their genetic and cultural legacy plausibly persisted, diffused and transformed into later Saharan populations, even as their specific political state and the specific engineering system that sustained it eventually did collapse. And that collapse is genuinely one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the more sobering parts of this entire story, because it's not a story about invasion or plague or some sudden catastrophic event. It's a story about resource math finally catching up with an engineering system that for centuries had seemed to defy the desert entirely. Let's go there now. Here's the twist we teased right at the start of this video, and it's the part of the Garamantean story that modern hydrologists and archaeologists find genuinely haunting, because it's not really about an enemy at all. It's about the fossil water itself. Remember, that underground aquifer beneath the Fezzan wasn't being actively refilled by rainfall. It was ancient water, deposited during a wetter climate thousands of years earlier, essentially a finite underground savings account. Every foggara the Garamantes dug, every new tunnel extension, every deepened shaft was a withdrawal from that account. And for a long time, that withdrawal rate seemed sustainable because the aquifer was so vast and the population drawing from it, at least initially, was relatively small. But here's the problem with a civilization built around continuous growth. The Garamantean state didn't stay small. Population grew. Garama and its satellite towns expanded. Agricultural output needed to increase to feed more people, support more trade wealth, and sustain an increasingly elaborate elite culture visible in those monumental tombs. And the only way to get more water in a landscape with no rainfall to fall back on was to dig more foggaras, dig them deeper, and extend existing ones further into the desert to chase a water table that was, gradually but relentlessly, dropping. This is where the archaeological and hydrological evidence lines up in a genuinely striking way. Later period foggaras excavated and surveyed by researchers tend to be noticeably longer and deeper than earlier ones, which is exactly the pattern you'd expect to see if engineers were being forced to dig further and further to keep reaching a retreating water table. Some of the later tunnels stretch for kilometers, far exceeding the length of earlier systems, representing an enormous escalation in labor and engineering effort just to maintain, let alone grow, the water supply. In other words, the Garamantes were caught in what's sometimes described, in discussions of unsustainable resource extraction more broadly, as a kind of engineering treadmill. Their success bred population growth. That population growth demanded more water. More water could only come from digging deeper and further. Digging deeper and further required more labor, more organization, more social complexity to manage, all of which in turn could support and encourage further population growth. Each step of that cycle probably felt, at the time, like an achievement, a testament to Garamantean ingenuity and resilience in the face of the desert. And it was. But it was also, without anyone necessarily realizing it, a slow-motion depletion of a resource that could never actually be replaced on any timescale that mattered to human civilization. By around the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the archaeological record across the Fezzan starts to show signs of real strain. Settlement patterns shift. Some smaller sites appear to be abandoned. There's evidence that agricultural productivity in parts of the region declined. Researchers studying the foggara networks have found signs that some tunnels were extended dramatically in a kind of desperate late-stage effort to keep reaching water, while others appear to have simply been abandoned once the effort required to maintain or extend them outpaced what the local community could sustain. It's worth being careful here because this wasn't a single dramatic collapse, No sudden empire-ending catastrophe with a clean date attached to it, the way we might talk about, say, the sack of a capital city. It appears to have been a genuinely gradual process, likely playing out over generations, as declining water availability in the deepest, most heavily exploited parts of the aquifer made it progressively harder to sustain the population and agricultural output the Garamantean state had grown accustomed to. Some researchers also point to broader regional factors compounding the pressure: shifts in trans-Saharan trade patterns, increasing regional instability across North Africa in the twilight of Roman power and beyond, and the general political fragmentation that swept the wider Mediterranean and North African world in later antiquity. Almost certainly, this wasn't purely an environmental story or purely a political one. It was both, tangled together, each amplifying the other. By the time later written sources, including early Islamic-era geographers, writing centuries after Rome had faded from North Africa, described the Fezzan, they're no longer describing the powerful Garamantean kingdom of Herodotus and the Roman writers. They're describing a region of scattered oasis settlements, still inhabited, still using Foggara-style irrigation in some areas, but no longer functioning as the unified, wealthy, expansionist state that had once negotiated with Rome and controlled key trans-Saharan trade routes. The core political structure of the Garamantean kingdom had, by this point, effectively dissolved. There's a genuinely sobering lesson embedded in this story, and it's one that modern researchers studying ancient water systems and unsustainable resource extraction have explicitly connected to present-day concerns. Fossil water aquifers around the world today, including, notably, the very same Nubian sandstone aquifer system partly beneath the Fezzan, and other similar ancient aquifers being tapped for modern agriculture in places like Saudi Arabia and the American Great Plains, are, in a very real sense, facing the same fundamental math the Garamantes faced 2,000 years ago. You can engineer your way to incredible short-term abundance by drawing down a finite underground resource, but if that resource isn't being replenished, the engineering brilliance that unlocks it doesn't change the fact that, eventually, the account runs dry. The Garamantes didn't fail because they were bad engineers. In many ways, they were spectacular engineers, arguably some of the most impressive hydraulic engineers of the ancient world, operating in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. They failed, if failed is even the right word for a civilization that thrived for the better part of 1,000 years, because they were up against a resource constraint that no amount of ingenuity could ultimately overcome. It's also worth noting something researchers have flagged about the human cost of that engineering treadmill, because it's easy to romanticize the achievement and lose sight of who actually paid for it in physical labor. As the Foggaras got longer and deeper in the later centuries of Garamantean civilization, the workload required to dig, maintain, and clear them almost certainly grew heavier too. More tunnel collapses to clear, more distance for workers to travel underground, more shafts to sink through increasingly resistant rock as engineers chased a retreating water table. Given the archaeological and comparative historical evidence suggesting a significant enslaved workforce was central to the Garamantean economy, it's a reasonable and sobering inference that much of the mounting physical burden of this engineering treadmill fell disproportionately on people with no real say in the matter, the unnamed, largely invisible laborers whose exhausting, dangerous underground work is the actual reason any of this system functioned at all. Their names are lost to history, but their labor is quite literally still visible today in the shape of every shaft mound and every kilometer of surviving tunnel across the Fezzan. For over 1,000 years after the Garamantean state faded, this entire civilization was essentially forgotten outside of a handful of brief, often unflattering mentions in classical texts. The desert reclaimed most physical traces of Garama and its satellite towns. burying walls, tombs, and foggara shafts under centuries of accumulating sand. The modern rediscovery of the Garamantes really began to accelerate in the 20th century, with Italian colonial-era archaeological interest in Libya during the early 1900s, providing some of the first systematic looks at Fezzan sites, though this early work was limited and colored by the priorities of the era. Real transformation came later, particularly from the 1960s through the 1990s, as archaeologists, including British researcher Charles Daniels, conducted more extensive surveys and excavations at Garama and surrounding sites, and began to seriously challenge the old dismissive picture of the Garamantes as unsophisticated desert raiders. But the real breakthrough, the moment this civilization went from a regional archaeological curiosity to something genuinely reassessed on a global scale, came with the application of satellite imagery and remote sensing archaeology, beginning in the 1990s and expanding dramatically in the 2000s. This is actually how many of those foggara systems we described earlier were properly mapped for the first time. From ground level, walking across the Sahara, individual shaft mounds might just look like unusual bumps in the sand. But from above, using aerial photography and later high-resolution satellite imagery, the full, staggering scale of the network became visible. Hundreds of separate foggara lines, some stretching for kilometers, forming a pattern across the desert floor that simply couldn't be appreciated any other way. Researchers, including teams working with the University of Leicester's trans-Sahara project in the 2000s and 2010s, combined this satellite data with targeted ground excavation to build the modern picture of Garamantean civilization we've been describing throughout this video. A picture of a genuinely major regional power, not a footnote. Unfortunately, the ongoing political instability in Libya since 2011 has made continued archaeological fieldwork in the Fezzan extremely difficult and, at times, outright impossible, and there are real, ongoing concerns among archaeologists about looting and site damage in a country where systematic protection of heritage sites has been severely disrupted. It's a genuinely bittersweet part of this story. Right as the world was finally starting to properly understand who the Garamantes were and what they achieved, access to their homeland became far more restricted, meaning there's almost certainly a great deal more still buried out there, quite literally, that researchers haven't yet been able to reach. What we do have, though, is enough to fundamentally rewrite the old narrative. The Garamantes weren't a minor tribal footnote on the edge of Roman North Africa. They were a genuine desert civilization, urbanized, stratified, internationally connected, and technologically sophisticated enough to engineer one of the most impressive water systems of the ancient world, sustaining a thriving population for centuries in a place that, by every conventional measure, should never have supported large-scale human settlement at all. Before we move into the closing stretch of this video, it's worth addressing a question a lot of history-minded viewers are probably already asking. Were the Garamantes the only ancient people to build something like this? The honest answer is no, and putting them side by side with their closest relatives actually makes what they achieved look even more impressive, not less. The broader technology of gravity-fed underground water tunnels almost certainly originated, or was at least independently perfected, earliest and most extensively in ancient Persia, where it's known as the qanat, with some Persian qanats dating back roughly 3,000 years and a handful of the oldest and longest examples still functioning, remarkably, to this day. From Persia, this technology, or independently similar versions of it, spread and was adapted across a huge swath of the ancient and medieval world, into the Arabian Peninsula, across North Africa under different regional names like Petra in Morocco, into Spain during the period of Islamic rule, where such systems were called qanats or minas, and even, much later, into Spanish colonial territories in the Americas. So the Garamantes weren't working in total isolation from this broader tradition of underground irrigation engineering, whether through direct contact, indirect cultural diffusion, or simply independent discovery of the same basic gravity-driven solution to the same basic problem. We honestly don't know for certain, and it's a genuinely open question among specialists. But here's what does set the Garamantean-Fogara network apart, and why hydrologists and archaeologists studying comparative ancient irrigation systems tend to single it out: the sheer hostility of the environment they were operating in. Persian qanats, impressive as they are, were typically built in regions that, while arid, still received meaningfully more annual rainfall than the deep Fezzan, and often tapped into aquifers, replenished, at least partially, by seasonal snowmelt from nearby mountains. The Garamantes were drawing from fossil water in one of the single driest, hottest, most remote inhabited regions on the entire planet, with essentially zero natural recharge, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest other major population center. If Persian qanat builders were playing a difficult game, the Garamantes were playing the hardest possible version of it, on the hardest possible difficulty setting, in the middle of the Sahara, and for centuries, they were winning. That comparison is honestly the best way to understand exactly why this civilization deserves so much more recognition than it typically gets. This wasn't a regional variation on a known technique applied somewhere moderately difficult. This was one of the most extreme applications of underground gravity-fed irrigation engineering attempted anywhere in the ancient world, full stop. And it sustained a genuine urban civilization with monumental architecture and international trade relationships for the better part of 1,000 years, in a location that today still ranks among the most punishing environments on Earth. We've talked about trade and engineering, but the Garamantes weren't just farmers and merchants. They were also, by every account we have, a serious military power in their own right. And understanding this side of them helps explain how they managed to stay independent of Rome for as long as they did, despite sitting relatively close to one of the most powerful militaries in the ancient world. Roman sources consistently describe the Garamantes as skilled raiders, capable of striking Roman settlements and then vanishing back into the desert before any effective retaliation could be organized. A classic asymmetric warfare advantage that desert-based powers have used against settled empires throughout history, from the Bedouin to the later Tuareg confederations. The Garamantes knew their terrain in a way no Roman legion ever could. They knew where the water was. They knew which routes were passable and which would strand an army without supplies. That knowledge was, in its own way, just as powerful a weapon as any sword or spear. The chariot warfare we touched on earlier likely played into this. Even if chariots weren't the primary vehicle for long-haul trade caravans, there's a strong case that they were used as fast, mobile strike vehicles in warfare and raiding, capable of covering ground quickly across the harder-packed desert surfaces near Garamantean territory, striking a target and retreating before a slower, heavier Roman military response could be mounted. Later in the Garamantean period, as camels became more central to Saharan life, it's likely camel-mounted warfare became increasingly important too, extending the range at which Garamantean forces, or forces allied with them, could strike or defend. This military capability is also, frankly, probably part of why Rome never fully conquered the Fezzan the way it conquered the North African coast. Rome's entire military and logistical system was built around supply lines, garrisons, and relatively short campaign seasons, none of which translate well into deep desert warfare hundreds of kilometers from the nearest Roman base, against an enemy who could disappear into terrain that was, quite literally, lethal to anyone who didn't know exactly where the water was. Balbus's campaign in 19 BCE captured towns and won a triumph back in Rome, but it never converted into permanent occupation or administration of Garamantean territory the way Rome absorbed, say, Egypt or the North African coastal cities. The Garamantes remained functionally independent for centuries after that campaign, continuing to build tombs, expand their water systems, and run their own trade networks on their own terms. One area where our knowledge remains frustratingly incomplete is Garamantean religion and belief systems, precisely because so little of their own writing has been fully deciphered. But the archaeological record, particularly those monumental tombs we mentioned earlier, gives us real, if partial, insight. The scale and elaborateness of Garamantean funerary architecture suggests a culture that invested enormous social and material resources into honoring and likely venerating the dead, especially elite members of society. Some of the largest tombs found near Garama are stepped, pyramid-shaped structures built from stone, standing prominently on the landscape in a way clearly meant to be seen and remembered. A permanent, visible marker of status that would have towered over the surrounding mud brick settlements. Grave goods found within many tombs, imported glassware, jewelry, ceramics, sometimes weapons, suggest a belief system involving some form of afterlife or continued existence in which material possessions retained importance, a pattern echoed across many ancient cultures, from Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world. There's also intriguing evidence connecting Garamantean religious practice to older, pre-Garamantean traditions in the Sahara, including possible continuity with the pastoral, cattle-venerating cultures whose rock art fills the caves and rock shelters of the wider Fezzan region from the earlier Green Sahara period. Some researchers have suggested this points to a genuinely deep cultural continuity in the region, stretching back long before the Garamantean state itself formed. The Garamantes inheriting and adapting belief systems and symbolic traditions from the very hunter-herder populations who had watched the Sahara dry out around them millennia earlier. What's clear is that this wasn't a culture without rich internal meaning and tradition, simply because it left behind less written material than Rome or Egypt. The tombs alone tell us this was a society deeply concerned with legacy, memory, and the visible, permanent marking of status and belief on the landscape. One more thread connecting the Garamantes to the broader family of great ancient civilizations, rather than setting them apart as some kind of lesser, peripheral culture. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how much of the Garamantean story we've covered in this video has only been confirmed relatively recently, through genuinely cutting-edge techniques that didn't exist even a generation or two ago. Isotope analysis of human remains recovered from Garamantean cemeteries has allowed researchers to reconstruct details of ancient diet, revealing a population that relied heavily on the crops we described earlier: wheat, barley, dates. Consistent with the irrigated agriculture the Fogara system made possible, alongside evidence of animal protein consumption from herded livestock. Genetic research on both ancient and modern populations across the Sahara continues to refine our understanding of how the Garamantes relate to earlier Saharan populations and to later and modern Berber-speaking groups, gradually filling in a family tree that, for most of history, simply didn't exist in any scientific sense. Satellite-based hydrological modeling has allowed researchers to estimate, with genuine scientific rigor, how the water table beneath the Fezzan likely changed over the centuries of Garamantean occupation, lending real, measurable support to the depletion narrative we described earlier, rather than leaving it as pure speculation. And ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques continue to reveal additional Fogara systems and settlement sites that hadn't been previously documented, suggesting that our current picture of the Garamantean world, extensive as it already is probably still incomplete. All of this matters because it means the Garamantes are, in a very real sense, still being discovered. This isn't a closed chapter of archaeology with all the answers already filed away. It's an active, ongoing area of research, one where new satellite passes, new excavations whenever political conditions in Libya allow them, and new laboratory techniques keep adding detail and, occasionally, overturning previous assumptions. The version of the Garamantean story we have today is dramatically richer than the version available even 20 years ago, and it's entirely possible the version available 20 years from now will be richer still. So what do we actually take away from the Garamantes 2,000 years later? I think it's this. The story of the Garamantes isn't really a story about a desert people who got lucky with a hidden water source. It's a story about human ingenuity meeting a hard environmental limit, and about just how far that ingenuity can carry a civilization before the limit finally catches up. For 30 generations, roughly, give or take, the Garamantes turned one of the most hostile environments on the planet into a genuinely thriving, wealthy, internationally connected state, through nothing more than remarkably precise underground engineering, tightly organized labor, and an intimate, hard-won understanding of the land and water beneath their feet. That's not a minor achievement. That's one of the more remarkable adaptive feats in the entire ancient world, and it deserves to be talked about in the same breath as the irrigation achievements of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Persian qanat builders, not treated as a footnote to Rome. And yet, the same system that made them extraordinary also, eventually, quietly undid them, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the simple, patient math of drawing down a resource that could never be replaced. It's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history, in different forms, in different civilizations, and, if you talk to hydrologists studying fossil aquifers today, it's a pattern that hasn't actually stopped repeating itself, even now, with all our modern technology. There's also something worth sitting with in just how long it took the wider world to properly recognize what the Garamantes accomplished. For close to 2,000 years, this civilization existed almost entirely through the eyes of its rivals, remembered, when it was remembered at all, as a minor irritant on the edge of Roman power, a footnote scrawled by people who had every incentive to downplay Garamantean sophistication and emphasize Garamantean savagery. It took satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, isotope analysis, and decades of patient fieldwork by archaeologists working in one of the more logistically difficult regions on Earth to finally set that record straight. That's a genuinely important reminder about how history actually works. The version of the past that survives in writing is very often the version written by the winners, or at least by whoever happened to have the most durable writing system and the loudest surviving voice. And it frequently takes hard physical evidence, dug carefully out of the ground centuries later, to give a fuller, fairer picture of who these societies really were. The Garamantes deserve to be remembered as one of the great, underappreciated engineering civilizations of the ancient world. Not the barbarian raiders that Roman writers made them out to be, but a resourceful, resilient, remarkably inventive society that, for the better part of a millennium, quite literally made water flow uphill through sheer human determination, in a place where water simply wasn't supposed to exist at all. Now, here's something we've only been able to touch on briefly in this video, because honestly, it deserves an entire deep dive of its own. Those chariot routes we mentioned earlier, carved into rock art across the Fezzan, showing Garamantean charioteers racing across the open desert. There's a genuinely fascinating and still hotly debated mystery buried in that rock art, because if you map out where these chariot depictions actually appear across the Sahara, they don't stop at the edges of Garamantean territory. They stretch much, much further, tracing what looks like an entire prehistoric network of desert routes, stitching together cultures we still don't fully understand, hinting at trans-Saharan contact and exchange centuries earlier than most historians ever assumed was possible. And that's not even the strangest part, because scattered along some of these same suspected routes, researchers have documented other rock art sites depicting animals that had no business surviving in a desert at all. Crocodiles, hippos, elephants, giraffes, a kind of frozen fossil record of the green Sahara painted directly onto stone by people who watched their entire world dry out around them, generation by generation, and kept painting anyway. Some of these images sit within a day or two's walk of Garamantean territory. Some of the routes plausibly connecting them may have been in active use by Garamantean traders themselves, centuries after the animals in the paintings had vanished from the region entirely. What that actually tells us about cultural memory, deep time, and just how far human contact and trade genuinely extended across the empty Sahara is a story that, frankly, deserves way more attention than it usually gets. If you want to follow that trail all the way across the Sahara, through the rock art galleries, the debated chariot routes, and the wider mystery of just how interconnected the ancient Sahara actually was long before the Garamantes ever dug their first fogara, that's exactly what our next video covers, and I think it might genuinely change how you picture the ancient desert altogether. Go check it out. It's linked right here on screen and in the description. And if this deep dive into the Garamantes was new to you, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we're building out an entire series on the lost and underappreciated civilizations of the ancient world. The ones history class skipped over, but the archaeology says absolutely shouldn't have been. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.